Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at Eduard's BF109K4 limited edition KÜRFURST. Really looking forward to this one, so let's take a look. So to get this K4 on the roll and moving, we're going to be starting off in the cockpit. Initially, as you've seen, I've fitted the back plating to the seat. Now I'm fitting the trim wheels and also a little bit of photo etch. In this KÜRFURST limited edition boxing, you get a full fret of photo etch, you get masks for the canopies, and you also get a huge amount of schemes. Now continuing to push on throughout the cockpit, everything slots into position with ease. There is on the whole no fitment issues throughout the entirety of this kit. And that also applies to the front control column. As you can see, it just slots into this indented position. Certain sections of the sidewalls do have to be cemented into position. Along with this, some tubing and piping has to be snipped off of the sprues very carefully, and they can also be joined onto the sidewalls. The process is repeated on the other side of the sidewall before then enhancing some details with some lead wire. After looking at some reference images, the BF109K4 cockpit seemed like quite a busy place, so after snipping different lengths of wire and cementing them in place with some superglue, I thought it was looking that little bit better. With the cockpit assembly all done now, I can start to prime everything. So the primer of choice for this build is going to be Mr. Finishing Surfacer 1500 Black. As you see, it gives a satin and a very smooth finish for me to then paint on top of. And the first colour which is going to be going down is Mr. Colour's C116 RLM 66 Black Grey. The paint itself is thinned 70% with Mr. Leveling Thinner and loaded into the airbrush and is being sprayed down at about 0.7 bar. 0.7 bar just gives me a little bit more control over the paint. And as you can see on screen, it is being modulated and mottled down. I'm modulating and mottling on the inners of each panel just to accentuate those raised details. After everything has been modulated, I can get out one of my finer brushes and my Amomig acrylic paint and start to pick out all of the raised details. I prefer to use Amomig acrylics for this task purely because they are more made for brush painting rather than lacquers, which are very sticky and they accentuate the brush strokes. The lower portion of the seat is dropped into its correlating position and then the harnesses can be added on top. These are photo etch and included in the kit. The final piece de resistance in the cockpit is the control panel, once again out of photo etch. It's very crisply detailed, and once the cockpit is secured, it looks great in there. And now to bring everything to a final uniform finish, I'm going to be using VMS's satin varnish. Finally, to complete the cockpit, I'm going to be doing a small amount of weathering, and to do this I'm going to be using a metallic watercolour pencil just to create some localised chipping. With that completed, I can now start to bring everything together. Initially, the tub is slotted into the left hand side of the fuselage, which takes a little bit of adjustment to get it into position. However, once it is secure, the right hand side portion of the fuselage can come and join it. As previously mentioned, the fitment on the entirety of this kit is very impressive, so not much filler was needed at all. There was a small amount of Mr. Dissolved putty used on that forward portion of the nose, but nothing too detrimental. This final rear bulkhead is slotted into position, and that completely wraps up the cockpit for this build. Moving on now to build up the external portions of the BF109K4 with all of its lumps and bumps and curves. This forward engine cowling section just slots into position very nicely, leaving a gap around it, imitating a seam, which is actually meant to be there, I believe. So with the external pretty much built up now, we can turn our attention to having a look at the wheel wells. The wheel wells are pretty comprehensive, potentially not as comprehensive as people like Mini Art, if you know what I'm talking about. However, they offer a huge amount of detail with relative simplicity. They build up with 4 sidewalls kind of going in a square type of shape, and this just maximizes the amount of detail which they can withhold with somewhat ease for the builder. Once I've done this for both sides of the wing, the upper surfaces of the wing can be slapped on top of them. It is a little bit fiddly to get them into position as the locating pins are not the most prominent. I actually ended up snipping them off on both sides of the wings purely because I think they were causing more issues than anything else. The spring-loaded slats are also slapped onto the front. The ailerons are slotted into position, and I can now turn my attention to the underwing radiators. These two grated parts are placed into position before then being enclosed with the housing for the radiator. After this is complete on both sides, the wing can be joined up with the previously assembled fuselage. After playing around with it for a bit and making stupid aeroplane noises, I did notice that there was two gaps at the rear here. So what I had to do was use Mr. Dissolved Putty again to reduce this gap. This magical substance of Mr. Dissolved Putty is almost like an out-of-the-box sprue goo. Sprue goo is brilliant, but you can really only use it on one type of plastic, and that is the plastic which you have made it from. I was introduced to this incredibly diverse and useful substance down at my local model shop, Hannants London. Hannants London is based right next to the RAF Hendon Museum, and it is a utopia for all things modelling. We have hundreds of kits, a stupid amount of paint, and also a lot of high quality tools. The joy of a shop like Hannants is that we have it there and we make sure that the product you are buying is the one best suited for you. For example, a product like Mr. Dissolved Putty, which is a little abstract and its application is superb, but if you don't like it, we also have other options available to suit your modelling needs. So if you're in the area, definitely come on down and check us out, and as a little bonus, I am down there working on future projects, which will be on your screens in the future. So to quickly catch up with what has been happening with the build, it has been fully built, fully primed in Mr. Finishing Surfacer 1500 Black, and now I'm working on the underside, specifically working with Mr. Color's C117, which is RLM 76. And similar to the cockpit, I'm approaching it in the same way, by initially modulating the colour onto all of the flat surfaces on the underside of the wing. When I say flat surfaces, what I mean is areas which don't have any recessed or raised details on them. And what this will do, as you will see, is leave a darkened rim around these details, and when I start to blend the colour back across and fill into a tone which I am happy with, it will still accentuate all of these details and they will really pop out at you on that final paint layer. What I've done now is I've loaded some flat white into the airbrush, and I'm going around now and actually starting to accentuate certain corners and just certain details around this wing. What this is going to do is break up the surface even more. As initially I only used that RLM 76, the tone will relatively stay the same throughout, whereas when I add this white into it, it will start to give the final tone some variation. To increase the variation and the saturation just one more level, I'm going to use this intermediate blue colour, very thin down, and just spray it onto certain areas and certain patches and panels of the model to completely alter its tone. And what this therefore does is when I then blend back in with the RLM 76 or Mr. Color 117, my goodness, that's a bit of a mouthful, each of the different panels is going to have a slightly different tone, and it gives this patchy and broken up sort of look, but it also still captures that RLM 76 colour. I do appreciate that that was an awful lot of words and it probably got a little bit confusing, but hopefully you can see on screen now that is the effect that it gives, and that is exactly what I was trying to explain. Now I can go right ahead and repeat that exact process, but this time using Sky Type S, and that is just my chosen colour to replicate a duck egg green, and as it isn't a specific colour that anyone knows, I think the Sky Type S looks pretty cool. I can now mask off the underside and also that leading edges with, hang on, am I reading that right? Scallop named scissors? Anyway, they give the right sort of effect, so that is what I use to mask off the leading edges. Now on to the next colour and working on the wings, I'm going to be using Mr. Color's C123, which is RLM 83. I can't keep up with all these RLM colours, but anyway, what I'm doing with this colour is I'm initially just spraying down the outline of this camo. These K4s were sprayed on freehand, which is why I'm not masking it off. To now commence the first bit of shading, I'm going to be using Mr. Color's C351, which is zinc chromate and pretty much just a more saturated version of this RLM 83, and I'm going to be creating these mottled L shapes. What these do is they accentuate the rivet lines, which are very beautifully moulded by Eduard, so I was making sure to accentuate them and make sure I didn't lose them on that final finish. To achieve these super fine and tight mottles, what I've had to do is thin the paint about 85% with Mr. Rapid Thinner, and I'm spraying at about 0.3 bar, which I think is in the region of 8 to 10 psi. So very, very low psi and very highly thinned paint. After I've created these shapes and these models, I'm just blending the effect back in to a degree which I'm happy with, and that's using once again the base color. And as you can see, that has really accentuated all of those rivet lines, and it looks cool. The final thing to do is going to be using a highly diluted flat white and a bit of masking tape and just doing some highlights off of certain panels. For those of you wondering why I haven't shown you the footage of me painting the RLM 75, it's because I'm using the exact same techniques as what I've just shown you on the green. And in my opinion, if I saw someone doing the exact same effect like 4 times on a build, I'd find it a little bit boring. So if you would like to see it in more detail, let me know in the comments and I will see if I can do that in the future. If not, let's carry on with the build. So after removing the scallop masking tape, such a weird name, one of my friends pointed out to me that it wouldn't have been hard edged and once again it would have been sprayed on. So what I did is just gave it a little bit of overspray. So now moving on to the upper surfaces of the fuselage, I'm going to start off by spraying down RLM 83. At this point it is being freehand sprayed onto the model and I'm not doing any fancy techniques, I'm just trying to get the basic outline of the green colour. After that is done, I can now use these 2 lighten shades, once again using zinc chromate, but also using Sky Type S to create these L shapes again, very similar to how I approach the wings. I've once again thinned this paint by about 85%, and as you can see on screen looking at my airbrush, the crown of the airbrush is gone, allowing me to get super up close and personal with the model. After doing these regions of highlights, I can use Mr. Colors C2 Gloss Black in a highly diluted solution to create some shading along all of the panel lines. This helped to create a slightly more balanced effect and tone to this rather bright green paint. After this has been completed, I can now move on to the second colour, which is slightly more specific. Eduard called for RLM 81 to be depicted as a mixture of red-brown but then also RLM 81, and it just didn't look right to me. So instead I'm going to be using this hull brown or hull red colour, which I think is a slightly better match. Like before, I'm initially just going to be outlining the basic shape of the camouflage before then coming in and starting to muck around with the tones. Whilst I'm creating these base shapes, I'm once again thinning the paint to about 85%. This just helps give a nice gradient between the duck egg green or the Sky Type S and also the brow violet as it's called. Now utilising red brown and also RLM02 to create the shading very much like what I just did on the green, creating a really fine mottle and the L shapes as you can see towards the back to create this shading and really break up that brown surface. After I've done all of this mottling, I can once again utilise that red-brown colour initially used to create the shapes and blend everything back in to a level where the shading is still prominent but not too in your face. Now finally, like I did before on the green, I'm going to reuse that gloss black and shade just along the panel lines. This once again creates a nice balanced tone and really finishes the effect. Now to do the mottling on each side of the fuselage, I'm going to reuse the 2 colours which I've just used on the upper surfaces of the fuselage, so RLM 81 and RLM 82, and I'm going to be thinning them about 90% and spraying them down at about, oh my goodness, I think it's about 8 psi here, very low. This isn't really a mottle as much as a misting of these 2 colours, as that is what they actually did in the German factories. This is the effect that I got at the end. The final bit of main painting for this one is going to be looking at the tail. The tail itself is a darkened version of RLM 74 with these green blotches in between. They are on the paint scheme a very hard edged, but after looking at some reference images they seem to have a slightly softer edge, so that is what I did. Flipping it over and going through the entirety of the aircraft, certain aspects had to be masked off and sprayed in that primer RLM02 colour. RLM02 is a rather interesting colour and it doesn't actually work very well with black basing, so all of these were sprayed in a uniform coat. Now that pretty much sums up the painting for this build, so to seal the entirety of the paintwork I'm going to be using VMS's gloss varnish. I haven't used VMS gloss varnish before and this is the general effect, so it is very glossy and worked well on the whole as a base for the decals. The decals themselves are up to the usual Eduard quality and I made sure to peel the carrier film off of each and every one of them. The one issue that I did have is there was a slight eating through of the VMS varnish in this place down here, but it was nothing that a little bit of VMS satin varnish, which is about to be used now, wouldn't cover up. I applied quite a heavy coat of that satin varnish just to try and hide that slight divot in the left hand wing. I'll also say this now, I do apologise for the slightly abstract swatch sticker on the back of the aircraft. That is just because YouTube is getting slightly angry at a few of my German videos. But anyway, we will not digress. Moving on to the weathering, starting on the underside, I'm going to be using Ammo MIG's PLW Storm Grey. This is just a mucky grey colour, and it is used just like any other panel wash. Instead of wiping off the excess, I'm actually going to use a clean brush dampened in white spirit and start to move any of the excess and blend it into the surroundings. I repeat this process exactly on the top half of the fuselage, however this time I'm going to be using PLW Black Night Wash. This is just because the mucky storm grey didn't work as well on these types of colour. I made sure then to leave it overnight just for all of the white spirit and the oils to cure, and this was the effect that I was greeted with early in the next morning. I think instead of wiping off the excess oil and instead blending it into its surroundings, it almost acts a little bit like a filter and it alters quite a few of the tones around the area, and it looks really quite convincing. To produce some more accumulated dirt and grime in certain areas, I'm going to be using Ammo MIG's Oil Brusher in Starship Filth. What I'm going to do is apply it straight out of the tin in very small amounts along a couple of the rivet lines, on the flaps, and also areas surrounding the gear bays. Then I'm going to get out my flat-headed and kind of soft-headed brush and then start scrubbing and blending in as much as I can. Considering I used a satin varnish, it is a little bit sticky and does require a little bit of work to get it to blend in, but if you stick with it, you'll be okay. Once again, using the Ammo MIG Starship Filth oil brusher, I'm going to be doing some streaks just off of one of those oil coolers. Initially, I brush in the general shape of the streak which I'm going to do, then using a rather fine-headed brush doused in some white spirit, I start to clean it up and refine the shape a little bit more. Then finally, to give it the final kind of blended in and slightly more natural looking effect, I'm going to take the brush which I was just doing some blending in on the inner radiators and flaps on, and I'm going to start blending in the tail. This just generally starts to give a slightly more smooth gradient and make everything look a little bit more in scale. And finally, just to add that one more level of grime, I'm going to be using a shader. Specifically, you guessed it, the Starship Filth shader. I really like Starship Filth colour. I think it works in a lot of different uses. Another use where I used it was actually for the exhaust stains as well. I didn't want to have the most prominent exhaust stains as K4s were very late in the war and I don't believe they had the most amount of use. So having a slightly more transparent and not as intense one worked really, really well. And that about finished up the weathering for this build. I found that I didn't have to do as much weathering as I usually do on some of my builds purely because I've spent so long mucking around with the shades and creating a slightly more hardened look in the painting stage. Making sure I don't leave any of these sub-assemblies unweathered. Here is the prop being stippled with a sponge doused in almost a sandy or greyish brown wash. This just creates the effect or impression of builds up of dust around, and I think it is also quite nice to break up that slightly dull colour. Now it's time to get the K4 standing on its own legs, so initially the tail wheel is pushed into position and secured using some super glue. I opted to put it at a slight angle to add a little bit of life into the model. The two main landing gear legs are also slotted into position, such good fit in fact that at this stage they were actually left friction fitted, allowing me to make sure that I got the right positioning. Then this underwing pitot tube, or I think it's a pitot tube, is fitted, and then I can turn it over and move on to the final bits and bobs. Now you can see me removing the masking tape for this inner window. It's a bit of windowception here. It's a window that goes inside another window, but that window is called the canopy, so a window inside a window. The mask can be removed from the Erla canopy, and then I can fit that window inside the other window. Too much talk of windows, but anyway, the mask can be removed from the front canopy, and then once that is all cleaned up, the Erla hood can also be cemented on in the open position, the rigging can be secured, and that about finishes this build up. So thank you very, very much for watching this video. I really do hope that you've enjoyed it. Next time we're going to be going on to something a little bit bigger, so I'll give you that as my little hint. But anyway, without any further ado, enjoy the final photos and videos, and I'll see you next time, guys. Bye bye.